The Škorpion weighed a little over 3 pounds. Its barrel measured 4.5 inches. Folded, it was shorter than a grown man's forearm. Yet it was not built for the soldier leading an assault. It was built for men who already had their hands full. Tank crews worked inside sealed steel hulls. Drivers gripped their controls with both hands. Radio operators carried sets, batteries, and cable. Artillery crews served the gun and nothing else. That narrow need became a program. Factories at Uherski Brod turned out more than 200,000 of them. A second nation copied the design and built its own. The little weapon did not stay in the tank. It slipped into coat pockets and the footwells of cars. It reached the Italian Red Brigades, the Irish Republican Army, and a French cell tied to Al-Qaeda. It fired a weak pistol round that struggled to stop a man past a few dozen meters. It traded power for a size that could vanish. That trade defined everything the Škorpion became. It was neither a shrunken submachine gun nor an overgrown pistol. It occupied the narrow space between them, a space most designers ignored because most soldiers did not live there. But some soldiers did. A tank crewman bailing out of a burning hull did not need a rifle he could not swing. A signaler ambushed on a road did not need a pistol that ran dry in seconds. They needed something in between, something that could ride in a holster and still answer a burst of fire with a burst of its own. The Czechoslovak designers set out to build exactly that, and the question they faced is the question this whole story turns on. How do you arm a soldier whose hands are already full? The answer they found was small, elegant, and quietly dangerous. It came from a country with a long tradition of fine gun-making, the same industrial culture that had turned out machine guns and pistols admired across the world. And it carried that tradition into a shape no one had quite built before. It would travel from a design student's drafting table to armored hulls, iron curtain border posts, a Rome side street strewn with dead bodyguards, Balkan sieges, African bush wars, and the collector racks of the world. It would outlive the country that made it. It would outlive the Cold War that shaped it. And it would carry, folded into its own small frame, a contradiction it never resolved. The men who designed it wanted to keep a helpless soldier alive. The men who used it most often wanted someone dead. This is the story of how one small weapon came to serve both. Chapter 1. The soldier who couldn't carry a rifle. A rifleman could give both hands to his weapon. Thousands of Czechoslovak soldiers could not. That simple fact, so easy to overlook in an army built around the infantryman, was the gap the Škorpion was made to fill. An army is not only the men who advance across open ground. It is drivers, mechanics, gun crews, radio operators, and officers whose primary duty leaves no room for a full-length weapon. For those men, the standard arm of the 1950s was a pistol. In Czechoslovakia, that meant the CZ-50, a compact handgun chambered for the .32 ACP cartridge. It was easy to carry and nearly useless in a fight beyond a few paces. That was the problem in plain terms. A pistol was small enough to wear, but too weak to defend a man against an enemy with a rifle or a submachine gun. A submachine gun could win that fight, but it was too long and too heavy to live inside a tank turret or a truck cab. The VZ-23 and VZ-25 submachine guns already in service were fine weapons for infantry, yet a tank driver could not stow one within reach, draw it in a cramped hull, and bring it to bear before an enemy closed the last few meters. The army had two tools. One was too little. The other was too much. Between them sat a need with no weapon to answer it. Consider the man that gap left exposed. A tank driver sits low in the forward hull, wedged between the transmission and the armor, his hands on tillers or a wheel, his knees crowded by the machine. If his vehicle is hit and he must climb out, he emerges into the most dangerous ground on the battlefield, often within range of the very infantry that killed his tank. A holstered pistol is all he can carry down there. It fires one round at a time and holds a handful. Against a squad, it buys him seconds, and not many. The same was true of the man who served an artillery piece, his hands full of shells and firing cords, and of the radio operator bent under the weight of his set, and of the junior officer whose hands were meant for maps and orders rather than a rifle. Each of them was a soldier the army needed and could not properly arm. The scale of that gap is easy to underestimate. A modern mechanized army is not mostly riflemen. Behind every rifle company stand drivers, gunners, signalers, engineers, medics, and mechanics. And in an armored force, the proportion tilts further still, toward the men who serve the machines rather than march beside them. Arm all of those men badly, and a large part of the army is a large part less able to defend itself. The gap was not a marginal problem affecting a handful of specialists. It ran through the whole force. Other nations had felt the same pressure and answered it in their own ways. A generation earlier, the United States had built a light carbine for its support troops and officers, men it did not want burdened with a full rifle, and had made millions of them. The Czechoslovak problem was that same problem in a smaller country, and the answer would be smaller too, small enough that the American carbine would look like a rifle beside it. Yet the comparison exposes what made the Czechoslovak answer harder. The American weapon was still a shoulder arm the size of a small rifle. The Czechoslovak designers wanted something a man could holster. A holstered weapon cannot be the length of a carbine. They were trying to compress the firepower of a shoulder weapon into the envelope of a pistol. And that compression, more than any single part, was the problem the whole design existed to solve. Every decision that followed, the weak cartridge, the wrapped bolt, the spring hidden in the grip, was a way of paying for smallness without surrendering automatic fire. The requirement had set two goals against each other and demanded both at once. The concept that answered this need did not yet have a name. Decades later, armies would call it the personal defense weapon, the PDW, and would spend enormous effort designing weapons for exactly the soldier described above. In 1959, the term did not exist. The requirement did. Someone in the Czechoslovak defense establishment recognized that a whole class of soldiers was being handed the wrong tool, and that a new one might be built to bridge the distance between the pistol and the submachine gun. Here, the tidy version of the story needs care. Popular retellings, including the framing that made the Škorpion famous, say flatly that it was built for tank crews. The record is less clean. Some sources describe it as a weapon for armored vehicle personnel, drivers, and lower-ranking staff. Others state that the impulse came from the Czechoslovak Ministry of the Interior, which wanted its police armed with more firepower than the CZ-50 pistol could offer, with the army joining later as a technical consultant. Both accounts point at the same underlying need: a compact weapon for men who could not carry a rifle. But they disagree on who first asked for it. That disagreement matters, because it is the first crack in the legend. The weapon that history would tie to armored crews may have begun as a police request. The evidence supports the need. It does not fully settle the customer, and anyone who tells you it does has chosen one source and ignored the others. What is not in dispute is the shape of the demand. The new weapon had to be small enough to carry like a pistol, capable of automatic fire like a submachine gun, and controllable enough that a man with little training could use it. It had to chamber a cartridge the country already stocked. It had to be cheap and simple to build in numbers. Each of those demands pulled against the others. Small size meant a light weapon, and a light weapon firing automatically wants to climb and spray. A weak pistol cartridge kept the gun small but limited its reach. A cheap design risked a weapon that could not survive hard use. The requirement was a knot of competing pressures, and the men who would untie it were not yet famous. One of them was still a student. Those pressures defined the whole project before a single part was cut, and they carried a hidden cost that would only appear years later. To make the weapon small enough for the crewmen, the designers would have to accept a cartridge too weak for open battle. That was the right choice for the man in the tank. It was also the choice that would one day make the weapon perfect for a killer working at arm's length. The army, or the police, or both, had described a soldier and asked for a weapon to fit his hands. The hands were full. The weapon would have to work around them, and the man who took up that assignment would begin not in a state arsenal, but in a classroom. Chapter 2. A thesis project called S-59. The weapon that would arm terror cells for decades began as a student's graduation assignment. It had to pass every test the army could devise before anyone in uniform would carry it. That is a strange origin for a firearm now bound up with kidnappings and assassinations, but it is the documented one. The Škorpion was designed by Miroslav Rybar as part of his postgraduate work at the Czech Military Technical Academy, begun in 1959. He did not work alone. He is recorded alongside colleagues Otakar Galas and Jiří Čermák, names that appear less often than his but belong in the account. The clean story of a single inventor is a convenience. The real one is a small team inside a military academy solving a specified problem. That correction is worth pausing on, because the lone genius version is the one that travels. It is easier to say that one man dreamed up the Škorpion than to describe a graduate project reviewed by an academy and refined through trials. The evidence supports a designer of record, Rybar, working within an institution and with named collaborators. He led. He did not conjure the weapon from nothing, and he did not build it in isolation. He also inherited a national tradition. Czechoslovakia had been a serious arms-making country since before the war, its factories exporting weapons around the globe, and Rybar was drawing on a deep well of manufacturing skill when he set out to solve his problem. The weapon that resulted took the name Škorpion, the Scorpion, and the name fit the design. A scorpion is small, easily overlooked, and carries its threat folded close to its body until the moment it strikes. So did the weapon. That the designers reached for such an image tells you how they understood their own creation, not as a battlefield arm to be feared at distance, but as a small thing with a sudden sting. The choice of the closed bolt belonged to the same understanding. At the prototype stage, the team had to decide whether the weapon would fire from an open bolt, like most cheap submachine guns, or from a closed one, like a rifle or a pistol. They chose the closed bolt, and the steadier first shot it gave, accepting the added complication of a separate hammer and the heat that a permanently chambered round would gather. A weapon that fires its first shot from a dead-still bolt can be aimed. A weapon that lurches into its first shot cannot. The prototype also had to survive the ordinary suspicion that meets any new design. An army does not adopt a weapon because a student drew it well. It adopts a weapon because the weapon endures trials that try to break it, firing thousands of rounds, working dirty and dry, dropped and abused. That the S-59 passed such tests is the reason it left the academy at all. The drawing earned respect. The trials earned adoption. The prototype that emerged carried the designation S-59, marking the year the work began. From the start, it was built to a hard set of numbers. The folded length was to come in around 250 millimeters, short enough to holster. The effective range target was 100 meters, modest by rifle standards but ambitious for a weapon this small. The weapon had to fire the .32 ACP cartridge, and that choice deserves its own examination, because it looks like a weakness and was in fact a decision. The .32 ACP, known in Europe as the 7.65mm Browning, is not a powerful round. It is a small pistol cartridge, and in raw energy it carries only a fraction of what a rifleman's round delivers, on the order of a tenth of the energy of a standard military rifle cartridge. By choosing it, the designers accepted a ceiling on what their weapon could do to a target. They did so for reasons that made sense inside Czechoslovakia. The round was already in national service. Police and military had used handguns in that caliber since the late 1920s. Ammunition, magazines, and manufacturing knowledge already existed. A weapon built around a familiar cartridge is cheaper to feed and simpler to field than one that demands a new round. The designers traded striking power for logistics and for the small size the low-pressure cartridge allowed. That exchange would shape the weapon's entire career, for better on the factory floor and for worse on the battlefield. The prototype had to prove itself, and by the accounts that survive, it did. The S-59 passed its mandatory tests, and the weapon entered service in 1961 as the Samopal VZOR-61, the submachine gun model of 1961, the VZ-61. One documented test result gives a sense of what it could do in trained hands from a fixed position. Firing at a target 100 meters away, the weapon placed 20 rounds into a circle roughly 8.5 inches across. That is a respectable group for a compact automatic weapon, and it tells us the little gun was not merely a bullet hose. In careful hands, braced and aimed, it could shoot. But a test range is not a battlefield, and the numbers that flattered the weapon on paper carried quiet warnings. 20 rounds into a small circle at 100 meters assumes a steady shooter, a folding stock deployed and shouldered, and single, deliberate fire. The same weapon, fired one-handed on full automatic, as an ambushed crewman might use it, would not group like that. The accuracy that trials recorded was real and also conditional. Fairness requires stating both halves. The weapon could shoot well when handled well. It could scatter badly when handled in the panic it was designed for. The trial record described the weapon's best day. The battlefield would describe its worst. That conditional performance was the price of the design's ambition. The team had been asked to build a weapon that was small, cheap, familiar in caliber, and capable of automatic fire. They delivered all four. The cost was hidden inside the fourth. A weapon this light, firing in a straight blowback action, wants to cycle very fast, and a very fast cyclic rate in a very small weapon is a recipe for lost control. The S-59 met its requirements. In meeting them, it inherited a problem that the designers would have to solve with a piece of hidden cleverness, or watch their compact weapon shake itself off target with every burst. The prototype had passed. The weapon had a name and a service date. What it did not yet have, in the eyes of the men who would carry it, was proof that its small frame could hold a burst together. That proof lived in its dimensions, and in a mechanism no one could see. Chapter 3. Small enough to disappear. The army asked for a weapon that would stay out of a soldier's way. It got one that could vanish into a coat. The dimensions of the VZ-61 are the heart of its story, because nearly everything the weapon became flows from how little of it there was. Loaded with a lighter magazine, it weighed only a little over 1.3 kilograms, under 3 pounds, with sources placing the empty weapon at around 1.28 to 1.3 kilograms. With its wire stock folded, it measured about 270 millimeters, well under 11 inches, and with the stock extended, it reached 517 millimeters, a touch over 20 inches. It was 43 millimeters wide, less than 2 inches. These are the measurements of a large pistol, not a submachine gun, and yet the VZ-61 fired on full automatic. Those numbers describe a weapon built to be carried and, if need be, concealed. A soldier could wear it in a holster on his hip or under his arm, and it was issued with a leather holster made to hold exactly this weapon. He could keep it stowed in a vehicle within easy reach. The folding wire stock, thin and simple, tucked over the top of the weapon when not in use, and swung out to brace against the shoulder when a man had time to aim. Held one-handed, the Škorpion could be fired like an oversized pistol. Braced against the shoulder, it became a miniature carbine. The same weapon offered two ways to fight, and a soldier chose between them by the second he had to spare. That choice was not a small one, and the weapon's upward ejection reveals which mode the designers truly favored. Brass thrown straight up clears the action cleanly when the weapon is held upright and shouldered, the way a man fires when he has time. Fired flat and one-handed, as a man fires when he does not, that same upward ejection throws hot cases across the back of the shooter's hand and into his line of sight. The weapon could be used one-handed, and its holster and its balance invited it, but the design quietly preferred the shoulder. It was a pistol in the way it was carried, and a small carbine in the way it shot best. A crewman who understood that would deploy the wire stock whenever the seconds allowed, and fire one-handed only when they did not. The difference between the two, on a bad day, was the difference between a burst that landed and a burst that climbed away into nothing. The sights told the same story of a weapon meant for close work. A flip rear notched for 75 and 150 metries is not the sight of a weapon expected to reach far. It is the sight of a weapon expected to fight at the range of a room, a road, a courtyard. Everything about the layout, the short sight line, the two modest range settings, the upward ejection that rewarded a shouldered stance, pointed to the same conclusion. This was a weapon for the moment when an enemy was already close, and it was built to be at its best in exactly the situation its user would least expect and most fear. Feeding the weapon were magazines of 10 or 20 rounds, mounted forward of the trigger guard and hanging below the barrel. The shorter 10-round magazine let the weapon sit almost flat, ideal for concealed carry. The 20-round magazine gave more sustained fire at the cost of a longer profile. Aftermarket makers later offered 30-round magazines, stretching the weapon's endurance further still. The sights were simple: a front post and a flip rear with two settings, notched for 75 and 150 metries, set along a sight radius of about 148 millimeters, under 6 inches. Those two range settings tell you what the designers expected. This was a weapon for fighting inside 100 metries and no farther. Spent cases ejected upward, clearing the compact action. A selector on the left side offered safe, single shots, and automatic fire. Everything about the layout served the same master idea, which was smallness. Stand beside the man this design served, and its logic becomes plain. A plainclothes security officer could wear a fully automatic weapon under a jacket and draw it like a handgun. No submachine gun in the world could do that in 1961. The VZ-61 gave a single man, in ordinary clothes, the sudden firepower of a weapon far larger than anything he appeared to carry. That was the point when the customer was the state. It would become the point again, with a darker meaning, when the customer was not. Here, a grander claim needs restraint. The Škorpion has sometimes been called the most effective machine pistol in the world, a phrase that reads well and proves little. Effectiveness depends on the job. Against an armored enemy at distance, the Škorpion was not effective at all. Its cartridge was too weak and its barrel too short to reach out and stop a determined man. What the weapon did better than almost anything else was hide, and then, at close range, deliver automatic fire from a frame that had looked harmless a moment before. Calling it the most effective machine pistol confuses two different virtues. Its power was ordinary. Its concealability was extraordinary. The evidence supports the second claim, not the first. And the difference between the two is the difference between a slogan and a fact. The weapon even resisted easy naming, and the dispute over what to call it is a clue to what it was. Its official Czechoslovak designation, Samopal, means submachine gun, yet in size and handling it behaved like a large automatic pistol, and writers have argued ever since over whether to call it a submachine gun or a machine pistol. The quarrel is not merely one of words. A submachine gun is understood as a shoulder weapon for sustained close-quarters fire. A machine pistol is understood as a handgun that happens to fire automatically. The Škorpion sat between those categories as surely as it sat between the pistol and the rifle, and every attempt to file it under one name or the other left something out. That it could not be neatly classified was not a failure of language. It was the most accurate thing language could say about a weapon built to occupy a gap. And concealability, the weapon's defining gift, cut both ways from the very beginning. To an army, a weapon a crewman could always keep on his body was a safeguard. The soldier was never disarmed, never caught with his defense locked in a rack across the compartment. To a security service, the same trait meant an operative could move armed through a crowd unseen. But the trait did not care who held it. A weapon small enough to hide under a soldier's coat is small enough to hide under anyone's coat. The design that protected the defenseless would, unchanged, serve the predatory. The Škorpion's greatest strength contained its greatest danger, and the two could never be separated because they were the same feature. That was the trade the designers had made, whether or not they saw its full shape. They had been told to keep the weapon small, and they had obeyed so thoroughly that they built something that could slip out of sight entirely. Smallness bought the army its crewmen's defense. It also built, into the weapon's bones, the quality that would one day make it the tool of choice for men the army never imagined. The advantage and the liability were one object, and that object weighed under 3 pounds. To see how such a small weapon could be fired at all without tearing itself off target, you have to slow the action down and follow a single round from the magazine to the moment it leaves as an empty case. Inside that cycle lived both the weapon's simplicity and the one hidden trick that made the whole design possible. Chapter 4. One firing cycle. The Škorpion is simple in principle and clever in one detail. Follow a single cartridge from the magazine to the ejected case, and the whole design explains itself. The weapon operates on straight blowback, the simplest system a firearm can use. There is no gas piston, no rotating bolt, no mechanical lock holding the breech shut at the moment of firing. The breech is held closed only by the weight of the bolt and the pressure of a spring. When the cartridge fires, the same gas that drives the bullet forward drives the case, and the bolt behind it backward. The system works only with low-pressure cartridges, because a powerful round would fling the bolt back too hard and too fast. The weak .32 ACP, so often described as the weapon's flaw, is exactly what makes this simple action safe. The cartridge and the mechanism were chosen for each other. There is a further refinement here that sets the Škorpion apart from most submachine guns of its day. It fires from a closed bolt, and it is hammer-fired. In most simple submachine guns, the bolt is held to the rear before firing and slams forward when the trigger is pressed, chambering and firing in one motion. That open bolt method is cheap and cools the chamber between bursts, but the lurching bolt spoils the aim of the first shot. The Škorpion instead keeps a round chambered and the bolt closed, and a separate hammer strikes the firing pin when the trigger breaks. The first shot leaves a still weapon, and that is part of why the little gun could group as well as it did on the range. The refinement bought accuracy. It also carried a cost, and the cost was heat. Begin with the weapon loaded and the bolt forward. A magazine of 10 or 20 rounds sits ahead of the trigger guard. The shooter pulls one of the cocking pieces rearward and releases it. The bolt runs back. Then the spring drives it forward, and on its way it strips the top cartridge from the magazine and pushes it into the chamber. Here the Škorpion's cleverest feature comes into play, the one that let the designers keep the weapon so short. The bolt is telescoping. Rather than sitting entirely behind the barrel, as in most simple blowback designs, the bolt is hollowed at the front so that it wraps around a large portion of the barrel when closed. This lets the mass needed for reliable blowback operation be folded back over the barrel instead of extending behind it. The weapon gains the heavy bolt it needs without the length that bolt would normally demand. The telescoping bolt is why a submachine gun action fits inside a pistol-sized frame. With the cartridge chambered and the bolt closed, the shooter presses the trigger. The hammer falls, the firing pin strikes the primer. The powder burns, pressure builds, and the bullet accelerates down the 4.5-inch barrel, leaving the muzzle at about 320 meters per second, a little over 1,000 feet per second. That is a respectable velocity for such a short barrel, though the light bullet sheds its energy quickly. As the bullet leaves, the pressure that pushed it forward is still pushing back on the case, and the case pushes back on the bolt. The bolt begins to move rearward, slowly at first because of its mass, then faster. The extractor, a small hook on the bolt face, has gripped the rim of the case. As the bolt travels back, it drags the empty case out of the chamber. An ejector strikes the case and flips it clear, and here, the Škorpion sends its brass upward, out of the top of the action, rather than out to the side. The bolt continues rearward, compressing the spring, until it reaches the rear of its travel. Then the spring drives it forward again, and if the trigger is still held on automatic, the cycle repeats. Two small details of that cycle shaped how the weapon behaved in the hand. The first is the cocking arrangement. The Škorpion carried its cocking knobs on both sides of the bolt, so a shooter could ready the weapon with either hand, a convenience that mattered for a man working in a cramped space or wounded in one arm. The second is the sheer speed of the sequence. The bolt's travel was short, because the weapon was short, and a short-traveling bolt completes its journey quickly and begins the next one sooner. That is the deep reason the uncorrected weapon fired so fast. Recoil in an automatic weapon is felt as a rhythm, a rapid series of small shoves, and the Škorpion's rhythm without correction was so quick that the shoves blurred into one continuous push that drove the muzzle skyward. A larger weapon with a longer bolt travel fires more slowly for the same reason a longer pendulum swings more slowly. The Škorpion had no room for a long swing. Understanding that blur is understanding why the grip had to hold a secret. The very shortness that let the weapon vanish into a coat was also what made it want to run away with itself, because the same small dimensions that hid the weapon also shortened the bolt's path and quickened its cycle. Smallness bought concealment and, in the same stroke, bought a cyclic rate that no unaided shooter could control. The designers had not made two separate choices, one good and one bad. They had made a single choice, to build small, and it handed them a gift and a problem in the same object. That is the entire mechanism, and its simplicity is a virtue. Fewer parts mean fewer things to break, and a soldier could strip and clean the weapon without special tools. But simplicity is not the same as perfection, and the honest account must address the claim, made about almost every famous weapon, that this one never jammed. No weapon never jams. When a Škorpion failed to feed or fire, the cause could lie in any of several places, and fairness demands naming them all before blaming any one. The fault might be a worn or dirty magazine, the most common source of stoppages in any automatic weapon. It might be weak or damaged ammunition. It might be fouling from firing without cleaning, or a lack of lubrication, or too much of it drawing grit into the action. It might be a worn extractor or a tired spring. The weapon was reliable for its class, but it was a machine, and machines built to fine tolerances in a small frame have less margin for neglect, not more. The Škorpion earned a good reputation. It did not earn an impossible one. The closed bolt design carried its own particular hazard, the second-order cost of the accuracy it bought. A round sits in the chamber at all times, and after sustained firing, the chamber grows hot. A cartridge left in a very hot chamber can cook off, its powder ignited by the heat alone without the trigger being pressed. An open-bolt weapon avoids this, because its chamber sits empty between bursts. The Škorpion, having chosen the closed bolt for its steadier first shot, accepted the small but real risk that a chambered round could fire on its own after hard use. The designers had traded one problem for another, gaining accuracy and taking on heat, which is the ordinary arithmetic of engineering. Every gain has a bill, and someone always pays it. There was, however, a larger flaw built into the very cleverness that made the weapon work, and it had nothing to do with heat or jamming. The telescoping bolt was light, because a small weapon cannot carry a heavy one. A light bolt cycles quickly. A quickly cycling blowback weapon fires very fast, and a weapon this small, firing very fast, is nearly impossible to control on automatic. The same design choice that let the action fit the frame threatened to make the weapon useless in the role it was built for. A crewman firing a burst one-handed would find the muzzle climbing off target before he could correct, the magazine empty in a heartbeat, the rounds walking up a wall instead of into a man. That was the price of the telescoping bolt. It bought the designers their short weapon and handed them, in the same stroke, a cyclic rate that wanted to run out of control. Solving that problem without adding length or weight was the real test of the design, and the solution was hidden in the last place anyone would look. It was not in the barrel, or the bolt, or the spring. It was in the grip. Chapter 5. The spring in the grip. A blowback weapon this small, chambered in .32 and fed from a light bolt, should be uncontrollable on full automatic. The answer to that problem was hidden where no one thinks to look, inside the pistol grip. Left to itself, the VZ61 would fire at a punishing rate. Uncorrected, its cyclic rate ran past 1,000 rounds per minute, by some accounts pushing toward 1,200. At those speeds, a 20-round magazine empties in about a second, and the shooter feels not a series of shots but a single lurch as the weapon climbs and empties. Such a rate makes a small automatic weapon almost worthless, because no burst can be aimed and no ammunition lasts. The designers knew this, and they built a solution so compact that the shooter holds it in his palm without knowing it is there. Inside the grip sits a rate reducer, a small mechanism of a weight, a spring, and a hook working together to slow the weapon down. The principle is a deliberate delay. When the bolt reaches the rear of its travel, instead of being allowed to fly forward immediately, it is caught and held for a fraction of a second by a hook. That hook is only released when a weighted plunger, sent traveling down a tube inside the grip by the bolt's own motion, reaches the bottom of its travel, compresses a spring, and is then pushed back up by that spring. The plunger's journey down the tube and back takes time, a very small amount of time, but enough. Only when the plunger returns and trips the hook is the bolt freed to run forward and fire the next round. The weapon is not made to cycle more slowly, it is made to wait. That waiting is the whole trick, and it is worth dwelling on how elegant it is. The bolt still slams back and forth at its natural speed. Nothing about the violent part of the cycle is softened. What the designers inserted was a pause, governed by a falling weight and a rising spring, tucked into a space that would otherwise have held nothing at all. Because the grip must exist anyway for a man to hold the weapon, the mechanism cost no extra length and almost no extra bulk. It borrowed the one empty volume the design already owned. That pause dropped the effective cyclic rate to somewhere around 840 to 850 rounds per minute. That is still fast, but it is controllable in a way that a 1,000+ rate is not. A trained shooter, bracing the folding stock against his shoulder, could fire short bursts and keep them roughly on a target at close range. There were other ways to slow a weapon down, and comparing them shows how neatly the Škorpion's answer fit its problem. The obvious method is a heavier bolt, which cycles more slowly because it takes more force to move. But a heavier bolt means a heavier, larger weapon, and weight and size were exactly what this design could not spend. Another method is a buffer at the rear of the receiver to cushion and delay the bolt, but that adds length behind the action, and length was forbidden too. The Škorpion could afford neither the mass nor the space that the usual solutions demanded. So its designers spent the one resource they had in surplus, the hollow interior of the grip, and paid for their slow rate with a falling weight rather than with millimeters or grams. It was less a brute force fix than a sleight of hand, slowing the weapon by making one part wait for another. That elegance carried a hidden bill, as elegant solutions often do. A heavier bolt is a simple thing, hard to break and easy to understand. The rate reducer was neither. It was a small assembly of moving parts, sealed inside the grip, that had to work every cycle for the weapon to stay controllable. When it worked, the shooter never thought about it. When it fouled or wore, the weapon's rate would climb, and the man holding it might not know why his bursts had begun to climb with it. The designers had traded a crude, reliable solution for a clever, delicate one, and they had hidden the delicacy in the last place a soldier could reach. Stand behind the weapon and you would never see the mechanism work, but you would feel its result. A soldier firing without the reducer would feel the weapon empty itself in a blurred instant, the muzzle leaping, the rounds gone before he knew it. With the reducer, he would feel a burst, fast but distinct, the muzzle rising but not leaping, the magazine lasting long enough to matter. He would not know that a weight was falling down a tube in his palm and a spring was pushing it back. He would only know that he could hold the thing on target, more or less. And that was the point. The cleverness was invisible by design, felt and never seen, which is the mark of a mechanism that truly works. The precise figures here deserve restraint, because the sources do not agree. The reduced cyclic rate is variously given as 750, 840, 850, and 900 rounds per minute, and the uncorrected rate as anything from 1,000 to 1,200. These differences reflect real variation between individual weapons, ammunition, and the condition of the mechanism, as well as the ordinary disagreement between sources measuring different examples in different ways. A worn spring slows differently from a fresh one. A dry mechanism behaves differently from a lubricated one. The honest statement is a range, not a single number. Left alone, the weapon fired well over 1,000 rounds per minute. With the reducer, it fired something under 900. The exact figure depended on the weapon in your hands that day, which is why careful accounts give a band and careless ones give a decimal. Even at the reduced rate, the weapon's endurance was measured in fractions of a second. A 20-round magazine emptied on automatic in well under 2 seconds. This is the quiet reality behind every dramatic image of the Škorpion. Its automatic fire was not a sustained stream, but a brief, violent cough. In its intended role, that was acceptable, because the crewman firing it needed only to break contact, to buy the seconds to escape or to reach a heavier weapon. The Škorpion was never meant to win a firefight. It was meant to survive the opening of one, and to do that, a second of automatic fire was enough. The reducer solved the control problem, but nothing is free. It added a mechanism to a weapon otherwise prized for simplicity, and a mechanism in the grip is a mechanism that can wear, foul, or fail. The designers accepted a small, hidden complication in exchange for a weapon that could actually be aimed. It was a good trade, perhaps the best single decision in the whole design. It also meant that the weapon's usefulness depended on a fragile piece of cleverness that the soldier could neither see nor easily service in the field. The Škorpion's control lived inside its grip, and so did one more thing that could break. An elegant mechanism, though, is only a drawing until a factory turns it into hardware by the 100,000. The VZ-61 had passed its trials and solved its central problem. Now it had to be built, in numbers, by a state that intended to arm not only its own crews but its allies and its clients across the world. Chapter 6. Uherský Brod. One prototype is an idea. 200,000 weapons are an industry. The VZ-61 was built at the Česká zbrojovka works at Uherský Brod, in Moravia, a factory whose name would become inseparable from the weapon. Between 1961 and 1979, the plant produced somewhere around 200,000 to 210,000 Škorpions. That is not a vast number by the standard of a wartime rifle, where output ran into the millions, but it is an enormous number for a specialized weapon built to arm a narrow slice of an army. The gap between what the requirement described and what the factory produced tells its own story. A weapon designed for crewmen and security men was made in quantities that guaranteed it would spread far beyond them. Building the Škorpion demanded precision out of proportion to its size. The parts were small, and small parts to fine tolerances are unforgiving. Consider the rate reducer alone. A weight and a spring and a hook fitted inside a grip, each component no larger than a few centimeters, each dependent on the others to function. A machinist at Uherský Brod holding one of those parts held something closer to a watchmaker's work than a blacksmith's. Errors that would vanish in a larger weapon could stop a Škorpion entirely. The telescoping bolt had to fit around the barrel closely enough to function and loosely enough to move when fouled. The tolerances that made the weapon compact also made it demanding to produce, and the factory's reputation rested on hitting them consistently across hundreds of thousands of units. This was a weapon that punished a careless shift on the factory floor as surely as a careless hand in the field. Interchangeability was the quiet demand behind all of this. A weapon issued by the 100,000 and expected to be repaired far from the factory that made it must be built so that a part from one weapon fits another without hand fitting. That is easy to say and hard to do when the parts are small and the tolerance is tight. Every dimension had to be held within a narrow band, weapon after weapon, so that a replacement bolt or spring drawn from a crate would drop into any Škorpion in service. The factory that could do that reliably had solved a problem larger than any single weapon, and the reputation of Czechoslovak's small arms rested on solving it. The cost was borne on the factory floor, in gauges and inspections and rejected parts, so that it would not be borne later by a soldier holding a weapon that would not take a spare. An error caught at the inspection bench cost one small component. The same error caught in the field could cost a man his only defense. The variants complicated that discipline further. Each new caliber meant new bolts, new barrels, new magazines, sometimes a rate reducer tuned to a different cartridge, and every added version multiplied the parts the system had to keep straight. A factory making one weapon in one caliber can perfect it. A factory making a family in several calibers must guard against the small confusions that creep in when similar parts are not quite the same. That the plant at Uherský Brod managed both the volume and the variety, holding fine tolerances across a family of weapons for nearly 2 decades, is the real industrial achievement behind the Škorpion. And it is the part of the story that never appears in the legend. The VZ61 was also the parent of a family, and the family reveals the limits of the original design as clearly as any critic could. The base weapon fired the 32 ACP, and a variant known as the VZ61E later replaced the wooden grip with a plastic one, a small sign of a design being updated for cheaper, faster production. But the 32 was weak, and the designers knew it, so they explored more powerful chamberings. The VZ64 was built for the 380 ACP, the 9x17mm Browning. The VZ65 was designed around the 9x18mm Makarov, the standard Warsaw-packed pistol round, and required a modified rate reducer to handle the different cartridge. The VZ68 went further still, to the 9x19mm Parabellum, the most powerful of the group, and to accommodate it, the designers had to roughly double the weight of the bolt and enlarge the receiver. Later came the VZ82 in 9x18 Makarov and the VZ83 in 380 ACP, the latter firing at a lower muzzle velocity of about 292 matrices per second. That family tree looks like progress, and in one sense it was, but it also exposes the trap built into the original concept. Popular accounts sometimes speak of the Škorpion as though the 9mm versions were mass combat weapons that supplanted the weak 32. The record is more modest. Several of the larger caliber variants, including the VZ64, VZ65, and VZ68, were development projects that saw little or no series production. The 32 VZ61 remained the definitive weapon. The more powerful versions existed, but they never displaced the original in the way the story sometimes implies, and treating the whole family as a single triumphant line of improvement misreads what actually happened. The reason they could not is the reason the whole design existed, and it is the sharpest trade-off in the weapon's history. The Škorpion was small because its cartridge was weak. Chamber it for a stronger round, and the physics of blowback demanded a heavier bolt and a larger receiver to keep the breech closed against higher pressure. The VZ68, firing full 9mm Parabellum, needed roughly twice the bolt mass and a bigger frame. But mass and size were the very things the weapon had been created to avoid. Make the Škorpion powerful, and you make it big. Make it small, and you make it weak. There was no chambering that gave both, because the smallness and the weakness were the same fact seen from two sides. Every attempt to fix the cartridge attacked the concept. The designers could have a pocket weapon or a potent one. They could not have both in one frame. And the family of variants is really a record of that impossibility, tried again and again in different calibers and defeated each time. The factory, meanwhile, made more than the Czechoslovak army and police required, and surplus has a way of walking out into the world. A weapon built in the hundreds of thousands, small enough to conceal, chambered for a common cartridge, and manufactured by a state that used arms as an instrument of foreign policy, was never going to stay inside its home country. It was designed to be carried unseen. It would be carried unseen across borders its makers never intended it to cross. The industry at Uherský Brod had solved the problem of building the weapon. It had also, without meaning to, solved the problem of distributing it, because it had made far more than one small nation could ever hold. Chapter 7. The weapon escapes its assignment. The Skorpion was issued to men who sat inside vehicles. It ended up in the hands of men who moved in the dark. The escape was not an accident of a few stolen weapons. It was written into the design and into the way its maker did business. A weapon built to be concealed will be valued most by those with the most to conceal, and a Cold War state that manufactured arms in surplus used them as currency. The VZ-61 left its assigned role along two roads at once, one official and one hidden, and often the two ran together. The official road began at home. The Skorpion was taken up not only by vehicle crews but by special forces and security services, for whom its concealability was not a compromise but the entire attraction. A weapon that could ride under a jacket and still deliver automatic fire was exactly what a bodyguard, an intelligence officer, or a plainclothes security man wanted. The same feature that let a tank driver keep his weapon on his body let an operative carry one through a crowd unseen. Within Czechoslovakia and across the Warsaw Pact, the Skorpion drifted from the motor pool to the security apparatus, from the man who drove the vehicle to the man who watched the room. That drift was not misuse. It was the natural pull of a weapon whose defining trait was invisibility. Stand beside such a man, and the appeal is obvious. A plainclothes officer in an ordinary coat, a Skorpion holstered beneath his arm with a 10-round magazine to keep the profile flat, carries firepower no one around him can see. He appears unarmed. He is not. In a role built on surprise, that gap between appearance and reality is the whole advantage, and the Skorpion offered it more completely than any other weapon of its day. The gun did not merely hide. It let a single man lie about what he was carrying, and win the lie. For a bodyguard, that lie protected a principle. For an assassin, the same lie would deliver a target. The tool was indifferent to which. The security use ran deeper than bodyguards. An embassy detail, a border post, a guard on a sensitive installation, all valued a weapon that could be kept out of sight until the instant it was needed, then produce a burst rather than a single shot. Behind the Iron Curtain, where the state watched its own people as closely as its enemies, a concealed automatic weapon was a natural instrument of internal security. The qualities that recommended it to a bodyguard recommended it to a plainclothes policeman shadowing a suspect or a guard watching a checkpoint. In each case, the weapon's value lay in what it hid rather than in what it could do at distance. That was the official life of the Skorpion, respectable and sanctioned, and it ran on exactly the same trait, invisibility, that its unofficial life would run on. The state trusted the trait because the state controlled the hands. The trouble began when the hands changed and the trait did not. Control was always the fragile part. A rifle in an armory is counted, locked, and hard to move unseen, and its size makes it awkward to steal and awkward to hide once stolen. A Skorpion is none of those things. The very features that made it valuable to a security service, its smallness and its silence of profile, made it hard for that service to keep track of. A weapon that fits in a coat fits in a bag, a car, a diplomatic pouch. The state that armed itself with such a weapon had also, without quite meaning to, armed itself with a weapon uniquely suited to slipping out of its own grasp. Every trait that made the Skorpion a good tool of control made it a poor tool to control. The hidden road ran outward, across borders, into the hands of clients and proxies. The Eastern Bloc moved arms as a tool of policy, supplying allied governments, friendly movements, and, through various channels, groups that served its interests at one remove. The Skorpion, compact and deniable, was well suited to this traffic. Where a crate of rifles announced itself, a weapon that folded to under 11 inches did not. Reporting and later investigation pointed to arms flowing from Czechoslovakia and the wider Eastern Bloc toward armed groups in the West, and to the involvement of state security services in some of that flow. Here the record demands restraint, because the tidy accusation outruns the proof. It is often said flatly that the Czechoslovak state armed Western terrorists with Skorpions. Parts of this are documented. Parts remain murky. Investigations, including Czech inquiries reopened decades later, examined the role of the State Security Service, the STB, in the movement of weapons to groups abroad. What the evidence supports is that the Eastern Bloc supplied arms widely, that the Skorpion's traits made it attractive for covert transfer, and that specific weapons reached specific groups. What the evidence does not cleanly establish, in every case, is a deliberate chain of command from a government to a killing. The distinction matters. A weapon can reach the wrong hands through policy, through theft, through the gray market, or through all three, and separating them after the fact is often impossible. The Skorpion reached terror groups. Exactly how each weapon got there is, in many cases, still not fully known, and honesty requires holding that uncertainty rather than replacing it with a satisfying story. That uncertainty is itself part of the weapon's story. A gun designed to be untraceable in a crowd proved difficult to trace across a continent. The very concealability that served the crewman and the operative also served whoever wished to move the weapon without a record. The Skorpion escaped its assignment because escaping was the thing it did best. Built to keep a soldier's defense invisible, it made its own distribution invisible too. The escape produced advantages for everyone who valued secrecy, and a cost that fell on people who never chose to be near the weapon at all. Security services gained a perfect concealed arm. Intelligence networks gained a deniable one. And somewhere at the end of the hidden road, a weapon built to save a trapped crewman was placed in the hands of people who intended to use its surprise for murder. The trait was neutral. Its consequences were not. One Rome morning in the spring of 1978 would turn the Skorpion's quiet escape into a name known far beyond the world of small arms. Chapter 8. Via Fani and the Skorpion Myth. Popular memory says the Skorpion killed Aldo Moro. The truth is more complicated and, in its details, still disputed. Aldo Moro was one of Italy's most important politicians, a former prime minister and the architect of a planned alliance between his Christian Democrats and the Italian Communist Party. On the morning of the 16th of March 1978, in Rome, the Red Brigades ambushed his convoy on the Via Fani, seized him, and killed the 5 men guarding him. 55 days later, on the 9th of May, they murdered Moro himself. The Skorpion is woven through this story, and its exact thread is worth untangling, because the legend has smoothed over what the record actually shows. Begin with the ambush. The attack on the Via Fani was fast and total. In a matter of seconds, the Red Brigades opened fire on the 2 cars carrying Moro and his escort. Accounts of the shooting record roughly 91 rounds fired, of which about 45 struck the bodyguards, and all 5 escort officers were killed. The weapons that did most of this killing were not primarily Skorpions. The heaviest fire came from a submachine gun, with other automatic weapons involved, and reconstructions attribute the bulk of the rounds to those larger guns rather than to the little Czech machine pistol. The Skorpion was present in the Red Brigade's arsenal. It was not the main instrument of the ambush. How reconstructions reach such conclusions is worth understanding, because it explains both what we know and what we cannot. Investigators recover spent cases and bullets, match them to weapon types by caliber and by the marks a given action leaves on brass, and count the rounds each weapon fired. That work can say with some confidence that a certain number of rounds came from a submachine gun of one type, and a smaller number from a weapon in a pistol caliber. It cannot always say which hand held which weapon, or in what order the shots fell. The presence of 7.65 ammunition among the evidence would point toward a weapon like the Skorpion, since that was the group's automatic weapon in that caliber, and it is partly from such traces that the association was built. But a cartridge on the ground names a caliber, not a crime. The forensic record placed the Skorpion in the story. It could not, by itself, make the weapon the story's center. This matters because famous crimes attract a certainty they do not deserve. A killing, as shocking as the Via Fani ambush demands, in the public mind, a clear account, a named weapon, a single guilty object. The evidence rarely offers that. It offers calibers, counts, and probabilities, and it leaves the neat sentence, the one that names a single gun as the killer, as an act of storytelling rather than of proof. The careful account has always said less than the legend, because the careful account is bound by what the brass and the bullets can actually show. The legend answered a hunger for a clean story. The record only ever offered a partial one. Stand for a moment with the men who died on that street. 5 bodyguards, ordinary officers doing an ordinary escort, caught in a killing zone from which the reconstructions say there was almost no escape. The attackers fired from prepared positions. The escort had seconds, and their weapons were holstered or slung. The very scenario the Skorpion had been designed to answer, a man ambushed with no time to bring a proper weapon to bear, played out on the Via Fani, and the weapon that might have been imagined as their salvation was instead in the hands of the attackers. That inversion is the dark heart of the whole story. The gun built to save the ambushed served the ambushers, and it would do so again and again in the years to come. Now the murder itself, and here the record turns genuinely uncertain. After 55 days of captivity, Moro was killed, and the accounts of how differ. One reconstruction holds that a first pistol, a Walther, jammed, and that a Skorpion in 7.65mm was then used to finish the killing, the rounds passing through Moro's chest. Other accounts assign the fatal shots differently or leave the precise weapon unsettled. The man who admitted to carrying out the execution described using pistols. The physical evidence, the testimony, and the later confessions do not resolve into a single clean picture. Italian and later Czech investigations continued for decades, and Czech authorities reopened inquiries into possible state security involvement as late as 2010. The case remains, in the words of those who have studied it, shrouded in unresolved questions. This is where the myth needs its firmest correction. The clean sentence, "The Skorpion killed Aldo Moro," is repeated because it is simple and because it fixes a famous crime to a distinctive weapon. The evidence supports a more careful statement. A scorpion was among the weapons the Red Brigades possessed. It may have been used in Moro's killing, and one account places it there specifically, but the sources conflict, and the matter is not settled. The weapon that dominated the Via Fani ambush was not the scorpion. The legend compressed a complicated, disputed, partly unknown sequence of events into a single, vivid claim, and the claim stuck because it felt true. It felt true because the scorpion was exactly the kind of weapon such a crime should involve: small, foreign, automatic, a spy's gun and a killer's gun. The feeling ran ahead of the facts, as feelings about famous weapons usually do. Why the myth attached itself so firmly is a question worth answering honestly. A weapon becomes a symbol when its image fits a story better than the details do. The scorpion looked the part. It was compact, exotic, unmistakably a tool of clandestine violence rather than open war. Tying it to the most notorious political murder in post-war Italian history gave the crime a face and gave the weapon a legend. Both the crime and the gun were served by the association, and accuracy was the casualty. That is how a symbol outruns its evidence. And the scorpion's reputation, once made on the Via Fani, would draw the weapon toward every story of assassination and terror that followed. Once a gun becomes shorthand for murder, every murder reaches for it, and the record struggles to keep up. Whatever the full truth of Moro's death, the effect on the scorpion's name was settled. From 1978 onward, it was the assassin's weapon in the public mind, and that reputation, deserved in part and inflated in part, would follow it into every corner of the underworld it was about to enter. Chapter 9. The Assassin's Tool. Its virtues on a battlefield were modest. Its virtues in a coat pocket were unmatched. That single contrast explains why the scorpion, a weapon of limited military value, became a fixture of terrorism and organized crime across 3 decades. The traits that made it a poor soldier's arm made it an ideal one for the killer who works close, moves unseen, and needs the certainty of automatic fire in the 2 or 3 seconds that decide everything. The weapon did not spread through the underworld despite its weaknesses. It spread because its weaknesses, in that world, were strengths. The list of groups that carried the scorpion reads like a map of late Cold War violence. It was, by one account, among the most commonly used weapons of Europe's armed factions, from the Irish Republican Army to the Italian Red Brigades. In the 1990s, a French criminal group known as the Gang de Roubaix, tied to Islamist militancy, used the weapon. Across these very different movements, separated by geography and ideology, the same small check machine pistol kept appearing. What united them was not politics, but need. Each required a weapon that could be hidden, produced automatic fire at close range, and could be obtained on the gray market that surplus and covert supply had flooded with scorpions. A Republican gunman in Belfast and a criminal in a French industrial town had almost nothing in common except the shape of the tool their work required, and the scorpion fit that shape for both. Stand beside such a user and the appeal is concrete. A courier carrying a folded scorpion under a coat passes through a checkpoint or along a street as an ordinary man. The weapon is under 11 inches folded and weighs under 3 pounds. Nothing about his outline betrays it. At the moment he chooses, he can produce a weapon that fires on automatic and empties a magazine in under 2 seconds at contact range. For an assassination, an ambush, or an act of terror, all of which happen close and fast, that combination is nearly ideal. The weapon's short reach does not matter when the target is a few feet away. Its weak cartridge does not matter when the muzzle is almost touching. Everything the scorpion lacked as a soldier's weapon was irrelevant to the killer's job, and everything it offered was exactly what that job demanded. The value of automatic fire in such work is easy to misjudge. A pistol can kill at contact range as surely as a machine pistol, and many killings have been carried out with a single handgun. What the scorpion added was insurance. A close attack often gives the attacker one chance and a moment of extreme stress, hands unsteady, target moving, no time to aim a careful second shot. A burst of several rounds in a fraction of a second covers for the unsteady hand, putting more than one bullet into the target in the time a pistol shooter would fire once. For a man who has to be certain, and who will have no second attempt, that margin is worth more than range or power. The weak cartridge fired many times at arm's length was, in cold terms, a more reliable killer than a strong cartridge fired once. That grim calculation, and not any battlefield virtue, is what drew the weapon to the people who used it most. The weapon's image did the rest of the work. Once the scorpion had appeared in famous crimes, it took on a second life in film and fiction, where it became a shorthand for the professional killer and the shadowy operative. That fictional fame fed back into its reputation, until the small check machine pistol was known to many who could not have named a single real event it was used in. The gun had become a symbol, and symbols recruit their own legend. Every appearance on a screen confirmed what the newspapers had suggested, that this was the assassin's weapon, and the confirmation ran ahead of the evidence just as it had after Via Fani. The scorpion was a real weapon with a real record. It was also, by the end, an idea that the real record could no longer quite contain. The cartridge deserves an honest reckoning here, because it sits at the center of two opposing myths. The 32 ACP is a low-energy round, carrying only a fraction of the energy of a rifle cartridge, and against a man at any distance, it is a poor performer. This has led some to dismiss the Škorpion as harmless, a noisy toy. That is wrong. At the range, terrorists and assassins actually used it, feet rather than dozens of meters. A burst of small rounds into a human target is lethal, and the weak cartridge's low recoil actually helped the shooter keep the burst on target. The opposite myth, that the Škorpion was a devastating superweapon, is equally wrong. It was neither harmless nor fearsome at range. The honest statement lies between. At contact distance, fired in a burst, it killed reliably. Past a short distance, it lost its power quickly. Its lethality was real and local was exactly where its users worked. That is the trade-off in its final, darkest form. The weak cartridge that had limited the Škorpion as a military weapon, that had kept it from ever becoming a true fighting arm, was precisely what made it manageable and concealable for the assassin. A more powerful round would have demanded a larger, heavier weapon that recoiled harder and hid less well. The 32 kept the weapon small enough to vanish and soft enough to control. The choice made in a Czechoslovak academy in 1959 to build the weapon around a familiar, feeble cartridge for reasons of logistics was the same choice that, 20 years later, made the weapon perfect for murder. The designers had optimized for a trapped crewman. They had, without knowing it, optimized for the killer too, because both men needed the same thing, a small weapon that fired fast and hid well. There was no way to give the crewman his tool without giving the killer his, because they were asking for the same tool. The reckoning cuts against easy judgment in both directions. The Škorpion was not a monster of a gun, and its notoriety exceeds its raw capability. Nor was it the innocent tool its dismissers describe. It was a weapon whose specific compromises happened to match the needs of some of the most dangerous people of its era. The gun did not choose them. Its features did not care whose hand held the grip. But the features were real, and they made the weapon what it became in the public imagination. The small automatic that turned up wherever someone needed to kill at close range and walk away unnoticed. A designer cannot answer for every hand that later takes up his work, but the shape of the work still decides which hands find it useful. While the Škorpion was earning its dark name in the streets and safe houses of Europe, another country had quietly decided that it wanted this weapon badly enough to build its own. The design that had escaped its makers was about to be copied by a second state and carried into a war its inventors never foresaw. Chapter 10. Škorpion of the Balkans. Czechoslovakia built the Škorpion. Yugoslavia decided it needed one of its own. The result was the Zastava Meters 84, a licensed copy produced by the Yugoslav arms industry, and it is a revealing chapter because it shows both how far the design had spread and how little anyone felt the need to change it. Around 1984, the Yugoslav arms factory, the works at Kragujevac, known through its history under names including Kravina Zastava, added the Meters 84 machine pistol to its line, produced under license from the Czech source. The weapon it made was, by the accounts of those who examined both, a direct copy of the Czech VZ-61. How direct is worth stating plainly, because it corrects a natural assumption. When one country licenses another's weapon, we expect improvements, national tweaks, a mark of the new maker's own thinking. The Meters 84 offered almost none. Observers comparing the Yugoslav Meters 84 to the Czech original found no meaningful differences in mechanical or external design. The changes were cosmetic. The grips were black plastic where the original had used a different material, and the pattern of grooves on the grip ran differently, horizontal where the Czech weapons had run vertical. Under the surface, the weapon was the same. It chambered the same 7.65mm cartridge. It used the same telescoping bolt. And it carried the same rate reducer in the grip, holding the cyclic rate down to roughly 840 rounds per minute, with the same note that without the reducer, the weapon would easily exceed 1,000. Stand beside the worker at Kragujevac who built it, and the picture is one of careful imitation rather than invention. His task was to reproduce a foreign design to the millimeter, to hit the same fine tolerances the Czech machinists hit, to fit the same small weight and spring into the same small grip. The Meters 84 was a feat of manufacturing fidelity, not of redesign. That fidelity is the point. Yugoslavia did not want a better Škorpion. It wanted the Škorpion, and it was willing to build the weapon almost unchanged to have it. The design had reached the status where a second nation would rather copy it exactly than improve on it, which is its own kind of compliment, paid in tooling and labor rather than words. The myth to correct here is small but instructive. It is sometimes assumed that the Meters 84 was an upgraded or modernized Škorpion, a second-generation weapon. The record shows the opposite, a faithful reproduction distinguished mainly by the color of its grips. Alongside the machine pistol, The Yugoslav industry also offered a semi-automatic pistol version, sometimes designated the Meters 84A, stripped of automatic fire for markets and buyers that could not take the full automatic weapon. That civilian derivative extended the design's reach, but it was a subtraction from the original, not an advance on it. The Yugoslav contribution was volume and availability, not advancement. And that contribution mattered, because it put more of these weapons into a region that was about to tear itself apart. Kragujevac was an old arms town, its factory one of the oldest and largest in the Balkans, and adding the Škorpion to its catalog was a routine act for a place that had been making weapons for over a century. That routine was exactly the danger. A design that a major state factory can turn out as ordinary stock is a design that will exist in quantity, and quantity is what turns a specialized weapon into a common one. When a country holds together, a large arsenal is an asset kept under lock and account. When a country comes apart, that same arsenal becomes a supply dump for every faction that can reach it. Yugoslavia's stores did not vanish in the collapse. They dispersed into the hands of armies, militias, and criminals who carried the weapons through the wars and then out the other side. The Meters 84's faithful ordinariness, a virtue on the factory floor, became a liability the moment the state that made it stopped existing. There is a bitter symmetry in that. The Škorpion had been designed for the soldier caught defenseless and alone, and in the Yugoslav wars it armed the men who made others defenseless. A weapon built to even a desperate man's odds became, in a war of neighbors, one more tool for shortening them. Neither the Czech designers nor the Yugoslav factory intended that. They had built and copied a weapon for a state's ordinary needs, and the state's collapse turned the ordinary weapon loose in an extraordinary and terrible way. The design did nothing it was not built to do. What changed was the world around it, and the world around a weapon is the one thing its makers can never build to specification. When Yugoslavia collapsed into war in the 1990s, the Meters 84 was there. The weapon saw use across the factions of the Yugoslav wars, carried by Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians alike. A single design turning up on every side of a conflict that had once been one country's army. The same little machine pistol that a Yugoslav factory had built for a unified state now armed the pieces that state had broken into. The weapon that Czechoslovakia had built for its crewmen and that Yugoslavia had copied for its own forces circulated through a civil war as a common tool, its origin as a specialized military personal defense weapon long since dissolved into general availability. That dissolution is the trade-off of the whole licensing story. Copying the Škorpion spread it fast and made it cheaply available, which served Yugoslavia's purposes in the 1980s. But every new maker meant more weapons in circulation, and weapons in circulation do not vanish when a war ends. They are buried, sold, smuggled, and inherited. The Meters 84s built at Kragujevac would outlast the country that made them, drifting into the same gray markets that had already carried the Czech originals across borders. The design's success at spreading was, once again, inseparable from its danger. Each faithful copy was one more small automatic loose in the world, waiting for a hand, and the wars that scattered them guaranteed that many of those hands would never be accounted for. From the Balkans, the Škorpion and its copies kept traveling into wars hotter and drier than any its Central European makers had imagined. The weapon built for the cold hulls of Warsaw packed tanks would end its long working life in the bush and the desert, decades after the men who designed it had retired. Chapter 11. Africa, Asia, and the Surplus Afterlife. A weapon built for Central European vehicle crews found its longest service far from home. The Škorpion's list of operators reads like a survey of the late 20th century's smaller wars, and the geography could hardly be further from the Moravian factory where the weapon began. Documented users and operators over the decades include Afghanistan, Angola, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Indonesia, Mongolia, Mozambique, Serbia, Slovakia, Uganda, and Yugoslavia. Some received the weapon through Cold War arms transfers, others through the surplus and gray markets that followed. Angola and Mozambique, newly independent and aligned with the Eastern Bloc, were armed in part with the same Czechoslovak weapons that flowed to friendly states across the developing world. The weapon that had been designed for a specific soldier in a specific army became, in its afterlife, a general-purpose, small automatic available to almost anyone. Consider how strange that afterlife is when set against the weapon's origin. A soldier in an African bush war, decades after 1961, carrying a compact Czech machine pistol designed for a tank crewman on the North European plain, is a long way from the requirement Rybar was handed as a student. The weapon crossed climates, conflicts, and generations. It served in tropical heat and desert dust, conditions its makers never tested it against, in the hands of soldiers and fighters who had never heard of the Ministry of the Interior or the vehicle crews of the Warsaw Pact. The Škorpion's durability and simplicity, the very traits that made it easy to build, made it easy to keep running in places without arsenals or armorers. A simple blowback weapon with few parts is a weapon that can survive neglect, and neglect was the normal condition of the wars it ended up in. That durability had a specific shape worth naming. The Skorpion's action was closed and compact, with no long gas tube or exposed piston to foul, and its few moving parts sat inside a small steel body that kept dirt out better than a larger, more open weapon would. In heat, it did not depend on delicate cooling. In dust, it offered less surface for grit to seize. In the hands of a fighter with no oil, no spare parts, and no armorer, a weapon that asks for little is a weapon that keeps working, and the Skorpion asked for little. Indonesian special forces reportedly valued it, and fighters in conflicts far from any factory that could service it carried it for the same reasons. The same simplicity that had made the weapon cheap to build in Moravia made it survivable in places Moravia had never imagined. A weapon designed for the tidy maintenance of a European army proved, by accident, to be well suited to armies that had no maintenance at all. The surplus market that carried it to those places was itself a kind of afterlife machine. Every war that ended left weapons behind, and those weapons did not retire. They were gathered, sold, and shipped to the next war, moving along the same hidden routes that had first carried the Škorpion out of Czechoslovakia. A gun made in the 1960s for a Warsaw Pact tank crew could pass through 3 or 4 conflicts and as many owners before it was finally lost, buried, or handed to a collector. The weapon outlived not only its makers, but the very purpose it was made for. And it did so because it was small enough to move, cheap enough to trade, and simple enough never quite to wear out. Its long life was not an accident of history. It was built into the metal. The myth to correct here is one of disappearance. It is easy to assume that when Czechoslovak production ended in 1979, the Škorpion faded into history, a Cold War curiosity retired with its era. The record says otherwise. Production continued elsewhere, in Yugoslavia and later under the Czech successor industry, and the weapon remained in service and in circulation for decades. Its working life was not closed by the end of its original production run. As late as the war that followed Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Czech Republic supplied a number of these weapons, reported as around 2,085 units, from its stocks to Ukraine. A weapon designed in 1959 was still being handed out from national inventories more than 60 years later. The Škorpion did not disappear. It kept turning up, which is what durable weapons do. Alongside the military afterlife ran a civilian one, and it grew into an industry of its own. The Škorpion's compact frame and distinctive shape made it attractive to collectors and enthusiasts, and semi-automatic versions were produced and imported for civilian markets, stripped of their automatic capability to comply with the laws of the countries that received them. In the United States, firms built and sold semi-automatic Škorpion pattern pistols, and makers such as Checkpoint offered the weapon to civilian buyers, while others, like Titus Arms with its interpretation of the design, produced lower-cost takes on the same classic pattern. These civilian Škorpions carry the puzzles that surplus weapons always do, questions of markings, import history, and origin that occupy collectors trying to trace where a given weapon was made and how it traveled. A weapon that had once been an instrument of state security became, in another country, a collector's object and a range gun, its violent history now a part of its appeal rather than a warning against it. Stand beside the modern owner cleaning a semi-automatic Škorpion on a bench, and the distance from the weapon's origin is complete. The trapped crewman, the security operative, the terrorist courier, the bush war fighter, all of them are gone from the picture, replaced by a collector for whom the weapon is history made small and holdable. That transformation is itself a kind of trade-off. The Škorpion's long life and wide spread, which armed so many conflicts, also carried it into the hands of people who value it precisely for the story it accumulated. The weapon's endurance was a virtue of its engineering and a consequence of its proliferation, and the two cannot be separated. The same simplicity that kept it running in a dozen wars kept it desirable on a collector's rack. It survived because it was well made, and its survival meant it never stopped circulating. 60 years of service on 3 continents, in armies and security services and terror cells and collectors' safes, is a remarkable record for a weapon that began as a graduate thesis. To judge it fairly, though, requires stepping back from where it went and asking what it proved. The Škorpion's true importance is not the sum of the crimes and wars it touched. It is the idea it embodied, an idea the world's armies would spend the next half-century catching up to. Chapter 12. The founding father of the personal defense weapon. The Škorpion answered a question the world's armies would spend decades re-asking. It got there first. Long before the term personal defense weapon entered military vocabulary, the VZ-61 was a working example of the concept, a compact automatic weapon for soldiers whose duties left no room for a rifle. The problem it solved in 1961, how to arm the crewman, the driver, the operator of equipment, was not a Czechoslovak problem. It was universal. And the fact that it took the rest of the world decades to build its own answers is the strongest evidence of how early the Skorpion arrived. The weapons that would later be celebrated as the pioneers of the personal defense weapon category came a generation after the Skorpion. In the late 20th century, designs like the Belgian FNP-90 and the German Heckler & Koch-Meters P7 were introduced to answer exactly the requirement the Skorpion had addressed: a small, controllable automatic weapon for support troops and vehicle crews, more capable than a pistol and more portable than a rifle. These later weapons made a different choice about the central trade-off. Where the Skorpion had solved the size problem by choosing a weak, familiar pistol cartridge, the P90 and Meters P7 chose new, small-caliber, high-velocity rounds designed to defeat body armor while keeping recoil low. They pursued the same goal by the opposite means, accepting a new cartridge to gain performance, where the Skorpion had accepted a feeble cartridge to gain simplicity. The debate between those two approaches never fully closed, and it is the Skorpion's question still being argued. A pistol cartridge is cheap, familiar, and easy to control, but it is stopped by modern body armor and fades quickly with distance. A purpose-built, high-velocity round pierces armor and reaches farther, but it demands new manufacturing, new logistics, and a weapon designed around it. Armies have gone both ways, and are going both ways still. Some fielding compact weapons in ordinary pistol calibers, others adopting the specialized rounds of the true personal defense weapon. The Skorpion sits at the head of the first road, the one that trades ultimate performance for simplicity and cost, and that road is still traveled. The weapon was early, and its specific answer was limited, but the question it framed, how much power to trade for how much size and cost, is the same question every designer of a compact automatic weapon still has to answer. What the Skorpion proved, in the end, was not that its answer was right, but that the question was real. For a time after its appearance, the major armies of the world did little with the idea, content to arm their support troops with pistols and their infantry with rifles, and to leave the space between them empty. It took decades, and the arrival of body armor and close urban fighting, for the rest of the world to return to the problem the Skorpion had already named. When they returned, they built better weapons than the little Czech machine pistol. But they were building in a space it had mapped first, answering a need it had been the first to take seriously, and that priority is the truest measure of the weapon. It was not the best answer, it was the first. And the first answer is the one that proves the question was worth asking. That contrast is the measure of the Skorpion's foresight and its limits together. It saw the problem clearly and solved it early, with the technology and the priorities of its time. Its solution was constrained by its choice of an existing weak round, which capped what it could ever do against a protected enemy. The later weapons, freed by decades of development and willing to invest in new ammunition, exceeded it. But they were answering the Skorpion's question, not asking a new one. The requirement the VZ-61 had proved existed, the armed support soldier who cannot carry a rifle, was the requirement they were built to fill. The Skorpion did not have the last word on the personal defense weapon. It had the first. The name itself proved as durable as the idea, and here a final, gentle correction is in order. The Czech firm that built the original later gave the world a modern weapon called the CZ Skorpion, the EV-03, a compact 9mm submachine gun of polymer and steel, adopted by police and military units in dozens of countries from Argentina to Vietnam. It carries the Skorpion name and the Skorpion roll, a small weapon for close quarters and confined spaces. But it is not the old weapon reborn. The modern Skorpion is mechanically unrelated to the VZ-61, having grown from a separate Slovak prototype rather than from the original design. What passed from one to the other was not the mechanism, but the name and the mission. The lineage is real, and it is a lineage of purpose, not of parts. To say the new weapon is the old one grown up would be tidy and wrong. The truth is that the idea outlived the machine and borrowed its name to keep going. The broader myth to set aside is that the Skorpion was an obsolete curiosity, a quirky little gun of historical interest and no lasting importance. The opposite is true. The concept it embodied became mainstream. Every modern army that fields a compact weapon for its crews and support troops is working within the category the Skorpion helped define. The weapon itself aged, its cartridge always its weakness, but the idea it carried did not age. It matured into a standard part of how armies think about arming the men behind the front line, and the modern weapon that borrows its name is only the most visible proof of that. Stand, finally, beside a modern crewman carrying a current-issue personal defense weapon, and the line back to the Skorpion is direct. He is the same soldier Rybar was asked to arm, a man whose primary duty fills his hands, who needs a weapon he can keep on his body and still fight with. The weapon in his hands is more advanced, its cartridge purpose-built, its design refined by half a century of development. But the problem it solves is the one the Skorpion solved first, and the soldier it serves is the one the Skorpion served first. The distance between them is technology. The need between them is identical. There is a final trade-off, and it is the one this whole story has circled. The Skorpion solved the crewman's problem so completely, made the weapon so small and so concealable and so controllable, that it also solved the assassin's problem. The design's success and its notoriety are not two facts but one. The weapon was celebrated by history as a pioneer and cursed by history as a killer's tool for the very same reasons. Because the traits that made it a brilliant answer to the crewman's need made it a brilliant answer to the murderer's need as well. You cannot praise the one without describing the other. The weapon and its shadow were cast by the same light, and they were never going to be separable because they were the same weapon. Which returns us to the trapped soldier where this began, and to the question his empty hands first posed. The problem was always the man who could not carry a rifle, the tank driver in his steel hull, the radio operator under his load, the officer with a pistol that ran dry in seconds. All of them needed something the arsenal did not have, a weapon small enough to carry always, and strong enough to matter when it was drawn. In 1959, a student named Miroslav Rybar, working with colleagues inside a military academy, set out to build it, and by 1961 the VZ-61 Škorpion existed, weighing under 3 pounds, folding to under 11 inches, firing a familiar weak cartridge from a telescoping bolt, its runaway speed tamed by a spring and a weight hidden in the grip. The factory at Uherski Brod built more than 200,000, in a family of calibers that only proved the original's central bargain, small and weak or large and potent, never both. And then the weapon escaped. It escaped into the security services that valued its concealment, and through the covert channels of a state that used arms as policy, and out into a world that its makers did not control. It reached the Red Brigades and the streets of Rome, where its exact part in the death of Aldo Moro remains disputed, but its reputation was sealed. It reached the Irish Republican Army and criminal cells and the arsenals of a dozen small wars. Yugoslavia copied it almost unchanged and carried it into the Balkan Wars. It served in Africa and Asia and turned up, more than 60 years after its design, in stocks handed to Ukraine. And it lent its name to a modern weapon still being adopted around the world today. It became, at last, a collector's object, its violence folded into its value. And through all of it, the weapon answered the same question it had been built to answer: how to arm a man whose hands are already full. And the answer was always the same: make the weapon small enough to hold in one hand and hide in a coat. That answer was its genius and its curse. The designers built it to keep a helpless man alive. History handed it to the men who left no one alive.